Welcome to Times Online exclusive interviews. Today we have Chair of Advocata Institute and CEO of JB Stockbrokers, Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee, in conversation on the economy of Sri Lanka and its future. Mr. Jafferjee, to start off with, how did we get here? How did the current economic crisis come to be?
Okay, so there were three causal factors. First is that we misallocated resources. So in a market economy, the prices signal the scarcity value of resources, and because our government interfered with the pricing mechanism in the market by putting price control, subsidizing, etc., there was misallocation of resources and overconsumption, which created excess demand. The second issue was that we have very low taxes. And there was a time maybe 20 years ago when our taxes used to be 90 to 20% of GDP, and they came down to something like 8% of GDP. And as you know, the infamous tax cuts at the end of 2019 caused the Treasury to have a huge drop in revenue, both due to the change in policy and the slowdown in the economy due to COVID. But expenditure did not contract, it actually had to increase because there was a lot of intervention due to COVID. So you had a large fiscal deficit also, which had to be funded, and invariably the central bank had to print money and fund the government. The third factor is that in any democracy there are institutional mechanisms, or many of these institutional mechanisms that are necessary for a market economy, for a democracy, to protect the rights of citizens, they all fail. Including institutions like the central bank basically and parliament. So those were the three causal factors that created this unmitigated disaster.
Could you explain the current status that we are at in the economy?
So the current status is that even the central bank has projected that the economy will contract by almost 10%. And as you know, 700,000 new passports have been issued this year. So some of our best and most talented people unfortunately are voting with their feet, and although there's an expectation of remittances, I mean these are some of your most productive and skilled people who are leaving the country. And then there's a sense of loss of hope, which I think is the biggest issue that the economy is facing. There is a sense of hopelessness, which I don't necessarily fully agree. I am actually, being a part of a think tank, I'm quite optimistic because this is a once in a generation opportunity to make the changes that will perhaps drive us for the next 20 years if we do it properly.
What about the foreign debt restructuring?
So, if you bucket the type of debt that we have, there are three buckets, what are called multilaterals, which are international institutions like the IMF, World Bank, ADB. There's a large amount of money owed to these institutions. That has not been restructured. It has not been suspended, and these come on very benign terms, and we are continuing to service this. We have suspended bilateral payments, of which China is the largest creditor, followed by India and Japan. And then we have commercial debt, Eurobonds, which we call ISBs, and there are some commercial bank loans, and there are some domestic debt issued under Sri Lanka law but denominated in dollars. So all of that debt we have suspended, except for the Sri Lanka development bonds, which are dollar denominated, which the government is servicing in the form of rupees. But the thing is that when you look at the totality of the debt, I'm told that when you take into account the guaranteed debt and the public sector debt, which includes the debt of the SOEs, it is said to be about 138% of GDP. And the perimeter of the debt suspension is only 28% of GDP. So I don't think that what we have suspended is going to be enough. We will probably have to widen the perimeter.
Could you take us through the local debt restructuring?
So the government's default position on this is that domestic restructuring will not happen. But let me, for the benefit of your viewers, explain one of the key variables in terms of looking at your debt sustainability is gross financing needs, which basically says the total amount of funds that need to be funded for the budget deficit in any given year plus all the debt that has to be rolled over. It is estimated that this year, in absolute terms, that figure is going to be 6 trillion. Our GDP is projected at about 25 trillion this year. So you get a ratio, that's one way to look at it, at about 24%. Now this ratio should be less than 50% of our current ratio. So the question is that with the foreign debt restructuring, is it enough to reduce 6 trillion down to perhaps 3 trillion? And when you consider that if you break the 6 trillion down, there is about 2.2 to 2.3 trillion coming from the deficit this year. And of that, 1 trillion is coming from what is called the primary balance, which is your total revenue minus total expenditure without interest. So the deficit is expected to be about 2.3 trillion, of which your primary balance is around 1 trillion, and the balance, about 1.2 trillion, is going to be interest. That is also part of your debt service payments. In addition to that, you have about 1.9 trillion rupees worth of treasury bonds that have to be rolled over, and about 2.2 trillion of treasury bills that have to be rolled over. Now, when you look at who owns the treasury bills, 2/3 of the treasury bills are owned by the central bank. And every year that this has to be rolled over. So, if we look at that 6 trillion, all this fiscal consolidation is only looking at the primary deficit, which is 1 trillion. And remember that 1 trillion for this year is about 4% of GDP. And as per the staff level agreement, by the end of 2025, we have to move minus 4% of GDP to plus 2.3% of GDP within 3 years, which is a very tall number, and I doubt it will happen. So, since the economy is contracting, it's going to be very, very difficult to correct these taxes, in spite of the changes in the tax policy. The changes in tax administration will take time, and we have a society that has not been used to paying taxes. I highly doubt whether they will be able to increase this amount of revenue in this very short period of time. Probably if we were given another 2 to 3 years, like 2027 or 2028, to get to that plus 2.3% surplus target, it may have been possible. But my sense is it's not going to be possible by 2025. So if you are unable to bring the primary balance into a surplus, and remember that's minus 1%, you have to swing it to about plus 600 or more than 1 trillion plus. Then you have all this other debt that is getting rolled over, and you've got a gigantic amount of interest which is coming to about 1.2 trillion, which is now getting repriced because the interest rates, our average debt on the domestic debt used to be about 7 to 8%. The new debt is getting issued at close to 30%. It's just that the average term to maturity of our domestic debt is about 5 years. So all of it doesn't get repriced overnight, it takes time. But the interest cost is going to keep climbing, basically. So what options do we have? When you say that the fiscal side, the primary balance is only 1 trillion of 6. The other 5 trillion is all to do with debt service. So you've got to push this out into a longer period, which means maturity extension, postpone the payment of the principal. And if there is 1.2 trillion worth of interest payments, will that need to be reduced by adjusting some of the coupon and interest payments? So there is a very high probability, in my opinion, of it having to be done.
There is a lot of conversation about the recent tax hikes. Could you please take us through the pros and the cons on it?
Yeah. So we have a society that has never been used to paying taxes. Now there's a lot of debate One is that whether somebody was deserving the tax concession in the first place. So let me explain the case of exporters. There is a perception that we are exporters and we deserve to have a lower rate of tax. Now, there is a key principle in taxation called vertical equity. So, if you are producing a product and there is a value chain, all the people in the value chain should be paying the same rate of taxes. So, take the example of the tea industry. I mean, you have people who grow the tea, which is converted to black tea, then there's transport, there's storage, there's insurance, there's freight, there's financing, there's brokering, then there's packing, and then there's export. There are multiple steps. So the principle of vertical equity says that everybody in the value chain should naturally be paying the same rate of tax. I mean, there is no justification unless there is exceptional reasons like there is a market failure or there is very large positive externality. So in this particular case, what the government did to say that everybody is going to pay 30% is the right decision to make. The thing they didn't address is the concept of vertical equity, horizontal equity, pardon. Horizontal equity means that two firms who are doing the same type of business, operating in the same market should be taxed equally. But unfortunately, due to these misguided tax incentives that were issued through the BOI and the most egregious ones like the SDA, Strategic Development Act, etc., you have situations that you could have two firms competing in the same market with the same product being taxed differently. And unfortunately, these BOI tax concessions that were issued many years ago don't have sunset clauses. So they enjoyed a tax concession or a tax holiday for X number of years and then a specified rate of taxation forever. So although the corporate tax rate is at 30%, you would have some of these firms at only like 15% forever. So there has to be something that the government has to do with sunset clauses to say that, you know, this benefit cannot be enjoyed forever because you don't deserve it. And second thing is, it's not fair. It's not fair. You know, there's no neutrality. There has to be tax neutrality. So those are the two basic principles when it comes to corporate taxation. And Duruthu, the thing is that the more people that pay taxes improves the chances of reducing the rate for everybody. So although there is a lot of grievances about these very high personal income tax rates of 36%, which I think is excessive, the only way that we can reduce it is to make sure that everybody who is eligible to pay taxes pay the taxes, so that we can reduce the rate for everybody basically. And this is where on the personal side that tax administration will have to play a role where people who are avoiding, and there has to be two things. One is that there has to be significant vigilance and by the tax authorities, and there has to be an equal social pressure on people to pay taxes, because you're going to have social tensions, because you will have one group of people who are law abiding and paying, and then you will have another group of people who are avoiding, and then obviously the two lifestyles are going to be very different, you know. So where is the equity in society? And you are going to start seeing issues coming up where there is social conflict or tension in society, especially in certain upper classes basically, that we have to show that people who avoid basically taxes is something that is going to be wrong. It's not something that should be admired.
The biggest spend in the government is defense. Do we need such a big spend?
So there are two schools of thought. I mean, one way to look at defense expenditure is to equate it to the size of GDP. And at the moment now we are below 2% of GDP. There was a time at the height of the war it became close to like 3% of GDP. But still, when you take it in context of the total primary expenditure, because although we spend about 19 to 20% of GDP as expenditure, we have one of the highest interest burdens, about 6 to 6.5% of GDP. So when you take the interest out, what is called primary expenditure is about 12 to 13% of GDP. and defense, security, because it's all different brackets. When you put all of that law and order into it, it's a substantial amount. I mean, it's estimated at about 400 billion. Now the question is that a country does need an effective deterrent, both for internal and external use. The question is that where is all this money going? And I don't have access to detailed information, which should hopefully be put out in the public domain so that the citizens can understand where all this money is being spent, not necessarily at extremely granular level, at least at some level of aggregation. But I would hazard a guess that most of it is salaries and basically rations and upkeep of these people. So there is first of all a case to redirect some of this expenditure into defense equipment and armaments, deterrent capability, which I don't think has been allocated large amount of budget space in the last so many years. The second argument has to be made that without a visible threat and without an ongoing conflict, do you need such a large standing army? And I had made a comment about the Sri Lankan military being larger than the British army, and that had gone viral. But the thing is that, the normal service period is like 12 years. So the question is that, could you move into a mechanism where you serve 4 years in the standing army and the balance 8 years in the reserve military, so that you don't have to necessarily feed and house the entirety of your capability at any one time. But you do have the reservists, if needed, to be called. I think that is a more sustainable model.
Is that practiced anywhere else?
Yeah, it's practiced in most countries. So if you look at the recent mobilization that was done in Russia, most of them were reservists who had served in the military before and been in the reserve corps. So a lot of countries do have reserve, and how my understanding is how it works is that you come for 2 weeks a year to retrain, etc., so that you are kept up to date, and then you go back to your normal job. And for us, there's a big benefit of that, because in the young men, there's a big shortage in the labor market, basically. So these are able-bodied young men, basically, who can be put back into the productive sector.
How will the Russian and Ukraine war impact the economy going forward?
So there were two ways. There was a first order effects and the second order effects. So first order effects means where our trade or interactions with Russia and Ukraine would impact us. So Russia was, I think, buying about 10% of our total tea. Russia is mainly a tea drinking country as opposed to many other Europeans who are coffee drinking countries. Russian tourists were also a source of arrivals to Sri Lanka, and there was a trade in goods. In the case of Ukraine, there was a trade in certain food items, and we used to sell tea, and also tourists used to come. But besides that, it will have second order effects because of the war. It has increased the prices of commodities. Of course, although some of them have softened recently. And it is also creating huge inflationary pressure in Europe, Western Europe, which is a large market for both our visible and invisible exports. So in terms of our apparel, the European Union probably is the largest single geography for our apparel exports. And for tourism, in terms of guest nights, it's Western Europe that is number one. You take the Brits and Germans, etc. So the conflict has had a big impact on the value of the euro because you have a very strong dollar, and their purchasing power has come down. And second is that high inflation has also reduced the amount of disposable income for discretionary items like leisure travel, long distance leisure travel. So we will be impacted. And we have another challenge ahead of us. In addition to what is going on due to inflation in the developed world, where interest rates are being increased dramatically, and there's a wealth effect where the stock markets are declining in value, and also housing mortgage costs are going up. So the aggregate demand, the ability of consumers to spend, which drives the need for our exports, is going to be impacted. And the apparel sector has already warned that, their order books are looking like 15% lower than the very high levels that they experienced in the first half of the year.
Mr. Jafferjee, there's a big disconnect between the stock market and the way the economy is performing right now. Can you please explain this?
Yes, so sometimes having spent my entire life in the stock market, I am also sometimes perplexed. So if you look at it at a very basic fundamental level, the key driver of demand in the stock market is interest rates. Now, interest rates on government securities are about 32%, and you can even buy very long-term bonds around those levels of interest. So if you're getting 32% on a risk-free instrument, you might want to ask the question, why take equity risk? Because you might get quite high returns, but then you get negative returns also. And share prices are the discounted value of future cash flows. So, throughout my career, the discount rate, the risk-free rate used to range from between 8% to maybe